Video games. They are among the most popular mediums of entertainment in our lives. Some even argue that they are platforms for art and expression. However, not all would agree. Many are of the opinion that video games are a scourge of the youth today in modern society, much like they argued back in the 70s. Video game violence in particular has caused much controversy since its conception, with many believing it's a corrupting force that both alienates and brainwashes the individual. Indeed, as we continue to delve into the mythos, video game violence, to a degree, does have a certain impact on the participant, especially children. The debate over video game violence can be tracked back to the 1976 release of the video game Death Race. The object of the game was to run over screaming gremlins with a car, at which point they would turn into tombstones. Controversy erupted because the gremlins resembled stick figure humans, and it was reported that the working title of the game was Pedestrian. After protesters dragged Death Race machines out of the arcades and burned them in parking lots, production of the game ceased. In 1993, public outcry following the release of violent video games Mortal Kombat and Night Trap prompted Congress to hold hearings on the regulating the sale of video games. During the hearings, California Attorney General Dan Lungren testified that violent video games have a desensitizing impact on youth, young and impressionable minds. Threatened with the creation of Federal Regulation Commission, the video game industry voluntarily established the ASRB in 1994 on September 1st to create the rating system. Based on the video game's content, the ASRB assigns one of the following ratings: early childhood, everyone 10+, teen, mature, adults only, or rating pending. The American Psychological Association observed in August 2015 that research demonstrated a link between video game violence increasing aggressive behavior and decreasing pro-social behavior, empathy, and moral engagement. The American Academy of Pediatrics warned that violent media set a poor example for kids. Video games, the Academy noted, should not use human or other living targets or award points for killing, because this teaches children to associate pleasure and success with their ability to cause pain and suffering to others. Overall, the Academy's summary of the results from more than 400 studies revealed a significant link between being exposed to violent media and aggressive behavior, aggressive thoughts, and angry feelings. A few studies tried to draw distinctions between good and bad games. In a 2010 experiment, Tobias Greedemeier, then a University of Sussex in England student, and Sylvia Oswald of Ludwig Maxwell University in Germany, asked subjects to play one of three video games, either a pro-social game, an aggressive game, or a neutral game, Tetris. After 8 minutes, an experimenter reached for a stack of questionnaires but then accidentally knocked over a cup of pencils off the table and onto the floor. Participants who had played the pro-social game were twice as likely to help pick up the pencils as those who played neutral or aggressive games.
Others have tried to tease out the after effects of playing violent video games. In a 2012 study, Andrew Melz of the University of Luxembourg, along with Mario Gollwitzer of the Philipps University Marburg in Germany, found that inexperienced players felt the need to cleanse themselves after playing violent video games. Researchers asked subjects to play either a driving game or the mayhem-heavy Grand Theft Auto for 15 minutes. Then pick gifts from an assortment, half hygienic, half non-hygienic. Inexperienced players who played Grand Theft Auto were more likely to pick out hygienic products than were experienced players or inexperienced players who had played the driving game. But neither of those studies made the case that these games led to real-world violence. Although drawing conclusions about small population subgroups from broad population trends can be dicey, it is still worth noting that as violent video games proliferate in recent years, the number of violent young offenders fell by more than half between 1994 and 2010, according to the US Department of Justice. Even if violent video games aren't turning people into killers, we might still wonder if they are harming our kids in subtler ways. As psychologist Douglas A. Gentile of Iowa State University puts it, whatever we practice repeatedly affects the brain. If we practice aggressive ways of thinking, feeling, and reacting, he writes, then we will get better at those. In a 2008 survey on the gaming habits of about 2,500 young people, Gentile and his father, psychologist J. Ronald Gentile, found that children and adolescents who played more violent games were more likely to report aggressive cognitions and behaviours. They concluded that violent video games appear to be exemplary teachers of aggression. However, an Oxford study suggests that playing violent video games is no more likely to be damaging to young children's behaviours than those considered harmless. Research involving British primary school children found that the length of time young people spend playing games, rather than the content, could have an effect on their behaviour or school performance, and even then only slightly so. But it concluded that fears that a generation of young people are growing up with their development impaired by exposure to violent video games are no more likely to be borne out than previous more panics over television and other media. The study, published in the Journal of Psychology of Popular Media Culture, found that children who play online games involving linking up with their other players were slightly less likely to have problems relating to other children. More than 200 academics have signed an open letter criticising controversial new research suggesting a link between violent video games and aggression. The findings were released by the American Psychological Association. It set up a task force that reviewed hundreds of studies and papers published between 2005 and 2013.
The American Psychological Association concluded while there was no single risk factor to blame for aggression, violent video games did contribute. The research demonstrates a consistent relation between violent video game use and increase in aggressive behavior, aggressive cognitions, and aggressive affect, and a decrease in pro-social behavior, empathy, sensitivity to aggression, said the report. It is the accumulation of risk factors that tend to lead to aggressive or violent behavior, the research reviewed. Here, this demonstrates that violent video games used in one such risk factor. However, a large group of academics said they felt the methodology of the research was deeply flawed, as a significant part of the material included in the study had not been subject to peer review. I fully acknowledge that exposure to repeated violence may have a short-term effect. You would be a fool to deny that. But the long-term consequences of crime and actual violent behaviour, there is just no evidence linking violent video games with that. Dr. Mark Coulson, Associate Professor of Psychology at Middlesex University and one of the signatories of the letter, told to the BBC. Overall, the Academy's summary of the results from more than 400 studies revealed a significant link between being exposed to violent media and aggressive behaviour, aggressive thoughts and angry feelings. Question about whether violent video games inspire violent behaviour in real life is a subject that strongly divides opinion. The APA task force used meta-analysis combining the results of lots of studies in order to look for correlations and patterns rather than carrying out any new research itself. Conducted a comprehensive review of academic work around the subject, some of which dated back to 2005. While there is some variation along the individual studies, a strong and consistent general pattern has emerged from many years of research that provides confidence in our general conclusions, said Task Force Chairman Mark Applebaum. However, this approach was criticised by the group of experts, which said some correlations sometimes had other explanations. For example, boys were more likely to play games than girls, but they were also more likely to be aggressive in general. Dr. Coulson also cautioned about work included in the study that may not have been subject to peer review. Obviously, there is a lot of stuff out there that doesn't get into peer review journals, he said. If you don't look at all the literature in this area, you are bound to get a sensationalist conclusion. When the US Supreme Court handed down the decision on the Brown v. Entertainment Merchants Association case on June 27, 2011, that ruling not only established that video games were covered under the First Amendment, but that video game content could not be regulated by governments. Part of the reason for the court's ruling was that psychological research linking violent games and violence was unpersuasive. Though psychological research is often used in courtrooms in issues relating to child safety, the lack of consistent findings connecting video games to violence behaviour in children helped sway the court against the regulation.
At the same time, there was a sharp rise in research studies examining the link between child violence and video games, though the results were rarely consistent. In an excellent overview of video game studies recently published in American Psychologist, author Christopher J. Ferguson of Texas A&M International University pointed out that many scholars working in the area of child violence added to the moral panic with studies that were often flawed. Other studies turned up no relationship at all between video game violence and antisocial behaviour in children. The debate over video games has led to a serious split between different groups of researchers, which was as much about politics as research findings. Whatever the status of the research so far, the only clear outcome is that the divide between pro and anti-video game activists seem as wide as ever, and both sides are citing research to support their arguments. In some cases, they are even looking at the same research studies and coming away with opposite interpretations of the findings. So then, what is the conclusion? The answer may ultimately lie with you. Video games and the violence within them do have a tendency to alter our psyche, as most studies have supported. However, they do not seem to literally push or intend to direct the individual down a path of violence. In conclusion, how a video game affects you remains entirely up to you. You can take in the violence as gratuitous, story-driven, or even as an art form. Whatever the case, there is no escaping violence in any other medium of life. Books, TV shows, films, and even the theatre can all exhibit these tendencies of blood and gore. The only difference is that with video games, the individual is usually the one enacting upon the violence. But it is also the consumer's choice to watch violent movies or TV shows, to read violent novels. It is all the matter of choice.